This should be played at high volume, preferably in a residential area.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time!
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah!
I finished these fights.
Give me a hell yeah!
Top Rope Nation.
Learn to love it. It's the best thing going today.
What's up, guys? This is Ryan and Kyle, and we're here with a special interview this week we are really pumped for. So we are joined today by the author of a wrestling book that I got to say has been getting a lot more attention than any wrestling biography in quite a while. I mean, unless you have been living under a rock, you have got to have heard of this. If you've been on Twitter, if you've been on Amazon, of course, if you've been on any of the wrestling sites, everyone's talking about the book. It is the biography on Brian Pillman. The title is Crazy Like a Fox, the definitive chronicle of Brian Pillman 20 years later. Joining us live from the UK, Liam O'Rourke. Welcome to Top Rope Nation. Thanks for joining us.
No, man, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of the show, and I'm glad to talk to you guys.
Very good. Glad to hear that. Keep tuning in.
Yeah. Well, Kyle turned me onto the show last year, and ever since then, it's just been it's kind of on my my playlist.
Awesome. Good to hear.
And this is only the second time that Liam and I have ever spoken, believe it or not. Liam and I go way back. Not a lot of people probably know that, but we go way back. But, we met for the first time around this time last year in the catacombs of the Citrus Bowl, if you remember, or Camping World Stadium. Pardon me, Liam. Yes.
Yeah.
As Dean Ambrose was working Baron Corbin in a kind of a phoned-in affair, but that's a different story for a different time.
Yeah, no, it was a great encounter, years in the making. It was kind of like a Savage Hogan kind of union, but I was very enthused to see that. I mean, of all the places too, it's just like, and I always kind of had the perception of like the Citrus Bowl as being this kind of grandiose area for some reason. I didn't realize in a real crack den part of Orlando.
It was,
but it's real kind of dumb. But yeah, in the middle of it all, in the middle of a Dean Ambrose Baron Corbin match that, like you said, phoned in as it was on the pre-show, but in the middle of you being rearranged from your seats, as I remember.
That's right. Yes, I did call it audible. I'm known to complain, and I was not shy about lifting my finger up as we had the obstructed seats last year at Mania, and I found a
I remember you texting me about that. You were pissed.
Yeah, I was like, come on, man. But I found somebody, and like he was like, all right, I'll help you. And then he kind of blew me off. I was like, hey, man. He's like, all right, come here. And he led us to great seats, and then it was even better. I didn't do the Mega Powers handshake when I met you, did I, Liam?
I don't think so, but we really should have. No, we should have.
But let's talk about the book. And it's funny we bring that encounter up we had last year at Camping World Stadium, because did you mention that you were doing a book to me? Was I too hammered to remember that? I mean, this is the question that I've been thinking about. For those out there listening that haven't heard you talk about this before, when did you come up with the idea of this book? And talk about the genesis of you writing it.
Yeah. So the Genesis was about 2 years ago. Probably a little bit more than that now, about 2.5 years ago, I'd say. So it was absolutely something that was in the works when we met, but I didn't bring it up just because, I didn't. It's one of those things that until it's done, I didn't really want to go around talking about how it was in the works because, I expect if I say, I'm going to do this book on Brian Pillman, for people to like just pat me on the head and say, okay, yeah, sure, good for you, kid, kind of a thing. But no, I mean, it really kind of a couple of years ago, I'd watch the WWE's DVD on him one more time, just like in the background one day, just to have something on. I don't know why, but it really kind of stuck in my craw watching it back, just how much of the story was missed. And because I've been kind of studying Pillman forever anyway, and kind of researching his life just for my own interest, I knew that there was so much that was missed. And I just remember thinking, you know what? This really is a story that actually requires a book to kind of summarize Pillman and how unique a personality he was and how incredible his career and his life story really is. And I just remember thinking, you know what? It's worthy of a book. Somebody should write it. And I think my brother actually kind of dared me because I was complaining about it. And he said, well, why don't you, if you think you know so much, kind of a thing. And, after about 6 months of kind of doing some kind of preliminary interviews and kind of getting my notes in order and stuff like that, I actually thought, you know what? I think that I could do a pretty good job of this and actually contribute something. I didn't want to just kind of knock together a half-baked thing. It was, but it's going to have to be pretty damn good, or I don't want to release it to the world. So even to the point where, when I met you, Kyle, and we were talking, at that point it wasn't completely fully fleshed out, and there was a lot of room to go. There's a lot of interviews I was still trying to land at the time. So I was very much at the mindset of it's going to get done right, or it's not going to see the light of day. So it was definitely something I was kind of keeping kind of close to the chest for most of those 2 years.
Okay, so I guess I don't feel terrible now, because I was like, when you announced it, I think on just your personal Facebook page, I was like, what? I was like, wow, that's unbelievable, man. And I'm like, did he tell me this? And I didn't contact you right away because I actually legitimately felt horrible that you might have said that to me, and I had forgotten. So now, for people who don't know you have a background in writing, correct?
Yeah. So I got a degree in journalism and editorial design from the University of Wolverhampton here in England. I wrote for a local paper doing sports for a little while. Ended up working in writing for medical journals of all things, which I'm absolutely not qualified to do in terms of medical. But I just kind of fell into people who kind of had the right connections, and it's very much kind of the same as this, where it's like you're interviewing a bunch of doctors and you're kind of trying to sift through fact and fiction and trying to put something together. And the way that it works in that world is that I would kind of work as like a copy, like a press release kind of guy. But when I'd send things out to these medical journals, they just say, like, instead of like doing what you would think like a lot of websites and stuff do, where it's like, we'll take it and we'll just reword it, which is what I expected. They would just come back to you and just say, we like the topic. Can you do 2,500 words? And then you kind of have to go away and interview a bunch of doctors and stuff like that. And that's pretty much what it was. So that was kind of my writing background for years. And obviously coming back here, I moved, kind of got away from that scene for a little bit. And I didn't have that immediate thing, that immediate kind of occupation to write about. So I kind of, it's like, I've got that writing itch, but I'm not working in writing at the minute. So it was kind of the perfect storm as well of the timing with the Pillman thing and the documentary, like I said. And it's kind of came together. And it's like, this is the perfect thing for me to write about. So yeah, and like you say, it's kind of it's my background anyway.
All right, here's a Kyle question for you. Okay, so you talked about the DVD. I'm glad you brought that up, because people forget that was one of the first full-length DVDs they did, I think. Yeah. It was like him and Jake Roberts. And it really comes through in the book, you being a fan. I'm obviously a big fan of Brian Pillman as well. Ryan is as well. So he's got this enduring legacy. And, obviously you were able to write a book, and we're talking about the guy 20 years later, a DVD. There were memorial shows for him. I was lucky enough to be at, I believe the third one. It was 2001 was the year I went. I'm almost positive. It was 2001 was the year I went. But here's my question to you. How do you explain him having this legacy that we're still talking about 2 decades later, when, the loose cannon persona essentially was 15, 18 months of his career? It didn't necessarily draw any money at the time. What is it that has been able to have, Brian Pillman be someone that we're still talking about 2 decades later?
I think the people who were kind of fans during that era, even like him entering WCW, he was part of a lot of firsts when I think about it. Like looking back, it's like him doing this stuff with Liger, and that kind of really breaking through in the early 90s, and kind of really standing out and being like the. I think there's so much of it that there's so many reasons why I think he does stand out. So it's just like everything from the fact that whole loose cannon thing appealed to a certain type of fan, a certain demographic that now kind of dominates Twitter and the internet, in terms of the kind of the quote unquote smart fan or the smart mark or whatever you want to say, and even going to the fact that he was the first WWF performer under contract, heavily featured, that died on Vince's watch. I think things like that all kind of contribute to there's fond memories of Brian. And he's an internet darling anyway. He was a typical almost guy for years and years and years with there's a baby face, and then with the blondes, and then with the loose cannon, and it's such a naturally tragic story anyway. And I think that the uniqueness of his personality to the people that were around him really is what sustains to those guys, and that's where you see the memorial shows and stuff like that. But I think in terms of the fandom, it's just that people look at him as like a classic case of just the ultimate guy who was such an overachiever and was very inspiring in that sense, but at the same time underachieved, because you could just see the potential for so much more. And I think that it really strikes a chord when you really go into it and you really think about how incredible the loose cannon scam really was that 6 months when he really was working WCW and working every end against the middle. I just think it's such a unique case. I think he's such a unique guy. And I think that I don't think that Brian was, I was talking to Mike Johnson about this, and it just kind of came up that, Brian was kind of the first in a lot of different ways, but it was, in terms of being on the crest of the wave, that kind of the edgy character in '96 when he became the loose cannon, and the high flying stuff with Liger. But it wasn't. I don't think it was that the business wasn't going to go that way anyway. I just think that it was that Brian was smart enough to see it was going that way, and then got ahead of the curve. Yeah, and kind of was the first in line. And I think because of that, a lot of people have got these memories of Brian that are really kind of striking, because obviously when that stuff becomes commonplace later, the Attitude Era or just high-flying wrestling in general, it becomes far more commonplace, it becomes less unique, and it becomes far less memorable. But when it's the first thing you see, it really kind of resonates with you a lot stronger, in the sense that I think like Shawn and Razor in the ladder match at Mania 10, to me is the greatest ladder match ever, because I saw it at the time, and I think I was blown away when I saw it the first time. But if you show fans now that ladder match for the first time, they probably wouldn't get the same thing out of it, I assume. And I think that's the case with Brian. It's just, if you were there at the time and you lived through it, you just have these vivid memories of just how unique he was. And then obviously dying, it's the classic, the Kurt Cobain type, the early death and what could have been. And I think that really kind of captivates the imagination of a lot of people.
I think I got a question kind of coming off of that, because you kind of hinted at it there and talked about it a little bit, but Kyle had mentioned how he didn't really draw any money at the time, and you're talking about how, he was at the beginning of the wave, and that's so accurate. Like, he was definitely ahead of his time. And so when you look at him, today, the internet fans would be all over that. Like, it would be a huge draw. Do you think the reason that it didn't draw money was because he was too much ahead of his time, or do you think you can just pinpoint that on the shattered ankle that he had that unfortunately kind of derailed everything when he came into the WWF?
I don't think it drew any money because he wasn't put in a position to draw money. I think that's kind of the charm of what he did as the loose cannon, was that he realized that there is nothing he can do in the position he's in to actually draw any money, because he was going to be kept in the middle no matter what. So how do you, when you're in a position where you can't actually, it's the typical thing, it's been talked about in wrestling for years and years and years. Unless you are positioned as a star, it's kind of hard to break through and actually become a legitimate star and draw real money. Very few guys are responsible for drawing big money. So because of that, and Brian knew, at that crucial point, he's 33 years old, he wants the better contract, but how am I going to get it when I can't prove in any real meaningful way that I'm worth it? And the whole idea of the loose cannon scam was not really to draw money, it was to draw attention, because in a world where at that point, late 1995, while the Monday Night War had started, neither company was really on fire yet. In fact, in December of 95, things were really looking bad for both companies. Like on pay-per-view, that month, December 95, was just rotten. But because of that, like the talk, the attention, that underground buzz, that became valuable because both companies are just looking for anything that can stand out and make a difference, perhaps. And to that audience, the underground, the newsletter readers, the ECW fans, Brian did a lot of stuff that basically made him the talk of that community. And even if Bischoff and McMahon weren't necessarily, listening to everything that audience was saying, they could still hear them. They're making a loud enough noise where people knew what Brian Pillman was doing. And he figured out that all I've got to do is make this loud enough noise to make it seem like, and it really was an illusion, just creating the illusion of value. When you can create the illusion of value, Vince will try and get you, and as soon as Vince tries to get you, Bischoff's going to want to keep you that much more.
It's funny you talk about that, and this is a God's honest truth. The first time I ever went in a wrestling chat room, it was 1996, the old AOL wrestling chat room.
Oh, yeah.
The first thing, I'm not making this up, that I saw was all caps, "Oh my fucking God, did you see what Brian Pillman did last night in ECW?" and that's like, so it speaks to like just how hot it was at the time and how it resonated. And I wrote down, I think there's no denying how ahead of the curve he was at that period.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I wrote down two words that you talked about, and there's obviously a dichotomy there: overachiever and underachiever, how he was able to kind of do that simultaneously. And I want to bring that into a discussion about today. Would Brian be more or less successful today, do you think? Because the size, which, and we'll double back to his time in WCW here in a bit, really kind of limited him in the eyes of a lot of those in power at the time.
Yeah.
But size is not that big of a deal now. I mean, the average wrestler today is is a lot smaller than it used to be, certainly when he came up. But at the same time, the attitude, how would that play in a WWE locker room, which strives to be so homogenous, no problems whatsoever, fall in line? I mean, how do you think, I know Kim Wood had some comments in the book about how Brian, would fare, but, how do you think Brian would fare into modern WWE?
I think he'd do way better now. I really do. It seems like the easy thing to say, but I really think he'd do better now, because I always notice this when Steve Austin talks to guys from the current roster, and he remember that horrible interview he did with Dean Ambrose on the network, where Ambrose was doing his usual laid-back, calm shtick, and Austin's there looking furious that this guy doesn't have the same kind of drive to succeed that he had. And I just think that as much of an issue as the size was in Brian's time, and how that wouldn't be an issue today, even though the attitude would be kind of slightly homogenized, I think that Brian's personal real life attitude was such that he was just going to find the way to succeed. Like, if he couldn't succeed with that, he was going to find another way. That to me is Brian's legacy, because he really is. When you actually look through the course of his career, he's really kind of a play in space kind of guy, because he realized when they were going to push him as a heavyweight in WCW in '91 that they were never going to do it properly. They were never going to treat him seriously because of the size. So because of that, he lobbies for the light heavyweight division, and he thinks that could be his key to stardom, because that way he'll be away from everybody else. He's trying to find a way. And they stick him in an interim tag team that's not supposed to mean anything. And he and Austin, again, through that drive to succeed, make it something great. And then, of course, that gets shut down. And then he comes up with a loose cannon and ends up, I think, had he not had the wreck, he would have had an incredible career. And I just think that if he was in today's environment, I think that he would have been more inclined to evolve. And that's one of the things that, homogenized environment or not, I think really feels like it's lacking in the WWE today, is that the guys don't really feel like they're evolving ever. It's like they arrive on the main roster and they kind of stay as they are. And it almost kind of feels like they kind of throw their hands in the air to a degree and think, well, it's not in our hands anyway, whether it's because it's kind of so heavily scripted or whatever. It's almost like, okay, when they arrive at the big dance, it's not in their hands to really progress, and everyone kind of feels the same once they get there. And I don't think Brian would have been like that. I think Brian would have been constantly wanting to do things different to try and stand out.
Yeah, I think the business just really lacks the spontaneity that it had at the time back then. Like, Brian is a perfect example of a guy who would have you on the edge of your seat. What's he going to do next? Like Kyle mentioned a second ago, what he saw in the chat room. Oh my God, did you see what Brian Pillman did last night? That's he was, Liam, you mentioned, he was the darling of the internet crowd, and it's so interesting because the internet crowd is the majority of the crowd these days, but it was such a small part of the crowd back then that, yeah, you got to imagine if he's around today, he would play to that most vocal part of the audience just perfectly. I think he would be a massive star too.
Oh yeah, well, like I said, he knew how to manipulate the audience and the surroundings around him. But I think that what's strange about it now is that as much as like there is that community that has the loudest voice, it seems like, at least obviously online, but like especially at the pay-per-views, you always notice the kind of that same kind of attitude at the pay-per-views. But I just think that, it's not supposed to be that way. And Brian kind of, I think he saw that it was kind of that kind of audience was gonna rise, and that, hey, it's better to be with them than against them, kind of a thing, and kind of use it for my benefit. But the whole idea at that time, because they were such a small percentage, was take advantage of them, manipulate them to be kind of making such a loud noise and talking about nothing but Brian Pillman, ultimately so that he could then get the better contract to appeal to the casual fans and be put in a position where he could really draw money and be a top star outside of that small bubble. And I think that sometimes it's to the detriment of the business that they kind of cater to that smaller bubble so much.
Yeah, I was going to say, would he go CyberSlam 96 on the modern audience and just, got to turn it on them? Yeah, turn them on themselves. I want to talk. You talked about, Brian, for those who did not follow his career in WCW. Other than Ric Flair, Brian had quite the rocky relationship with the other bookers in charge, generally speaking. And I'm a big guy with match recs and stuff like that. And, the attention to detail in this book, as everyone has probably heard by now who's followed it, is incredible. And as a big wrestling fan, whenever I read something like this, I don't know what you think, Ryan or Liam, when you read other people's books. If you think this way, I'm always intrigued on, it's like, okay, I've got this preconceived notion. This is what I think happened. Is this going to be confirmed by me? And so there was one story in particular I was looking for throughout this book, and it was confirmed. Fall Brawl 95 against Johnny B. Bad. To me, the backstage story surrounding that match and what Brian was able to do in spite of how he was set up to fail is sort of a what's the word I'm looking for? I think is the perfect illustration of Brian's career. Would you agree with that? And you can go into the situation. I don't want you to give away too much that's in the book, Liam, but you can go into that situation how much ever you want. Would you agree that that's kind of the perfect illustration of Pillman's career?
Oh, for sure. Because think about this. Like, this is a pay-per-view that they are kind of putting something on there in Bad and Pillman, who, for those who don't know, two baby faces. And Pillman wasn't a particularly hot baby face because he'd been doing nothing for a long, long time. To go out there for 30 minutes with like no real issue, just a fairly cold match, dump him out there and go for, because the whole idea at the time was that Sullivan had just become the booker and he'd had his idea and was loudly touting about how we'll have the big stars like Hogan on top, but we'll have the workers underneath carrying the show. And I think that Hogan was kind of trying to, and it was a Hogan call, but it was the idea of putting some of these guys in their place to let them know that, that this kind of attitude will fail. And just the thought that they will put something on TV, on pay-per-view no less, that their most loyal audience in theory, deliberately hoping that something doesn't work, and Brian finding a way to make it work. And if you watch that match back, it's really quite remarkable because, again, the fans are cold early because there's nothing really to get into, because why would you? But they work so hard, and it's just such a well-done match where by the end that they're popping for everything. And they come out where both guys come out looking better. Pillman comes out looking stronger even though he lost. It's just such a great situation where, like you say, here he is dumped in a position to fail, deliberately fail, because they didn't want these guys getting over, and yet he somehow turned it around and made it work for himself and came out better for it.
And that night, later on, was when he interfered in the Arn Anderson Ric Flair match, helped Arn win. It's so, again, I just think it's such a perfect illustration of his career and how he succeeded in spite of some of those on top. That, you could argue that was like the big breakthrough of his career. Because
and he thought so too.
Yeah, he was headlining Nitros after that, and would go on to become a Horseman. A month later. Yeah,
I mean, he thought that when that, I remember from what I was taught, I remember Meltzer saying this to me, that he thought going in that show was not going to be, even though it was going to be involved with Arn and stuff like that, he didn't know how well it would play out. And then when the show was finished, it's like, okay, he can see that the Horseman's on the horizon. I just had this match where it got over great. I'm a heel, which he really, really wanted to be at that point. He badly wanted to be a heel. And I remember just the whole thing when I was talking to Meltzer about it was that he'd said that, in talking to Brian, that Brian had said, when this Horseman thing pulls off, this is going to be the thing that, protects me politically, because that's what he thought it would be. And then it really wasn't that. It really wasn't what he thought it was going to be. And I think about a month in, he kind of realized that he's going to have to take matters into his own hands again.
Yeah, you mentioned Meltzer. Let me just throw this name out. Dave is always a hot topic on Twitter, and he obviously contributed. Dave, I mean, everyone. I think it's pretty well known that Dave was very good friends with Brian. Talk about you dealing with Dave, what that was like, and him helping you, with stories and get this project moving.
Yeah, so it was like. When I spoke to Kim Wood, Kim was one of the first guys I spoke to when I was actually putting the book together a couple of years back. And when I did, he'd said to me, no matter what happens, no matter what it takes, no matter what you have to do, you have to talk to Dave. Because if you don't talk to Dave, you're just not going to get the full picture. Dave's the guy that really knows. Dave was in there in the trenches with Brian in a lot of different situations. He was working. It was always a point of reference for Brian during the negotiations back and forth with WCW and WWF, because Meltzer spoke to everyone. And because of that, he was able to kind of get access to what they were thinking and could gauge how to approach both sides. And obviously it goes far deeper than that, years and years back. But it took me like a year to get Dave on the phone. it was constant. Like every week, the Observer would be released, and I'd say, "Hey, Dave, how are you looking for the next week?" And it would always be, he would always like reply, and he would always talk to me back and forth, and kind of answer questions anyway. But it was always like I don't know when we're gonna have the time to actually do the talk because it was gonna have to be a long discussion. And he's got such a crazy schedule that it's not like he's got like 5 hours free at the drop of a hat. So it took a long time to get together, but we finally did. And when we did, it was totally worth waiting for. Just not because of necessarily him, kind of giving me any stories I didn't already know, but just the context of what other people were thinking at the time really kind of helped lay the groundwork for the book a little bit deeper. Just the way that the politics moved. It was really interesting to kind of hear from him about him remembering when I would kind of throw something at him about something that Brian did, and him being able to say, yeah, I remember this was the reaction and this is what Brian had to do. Just little, a lot of little things, but it kind of really helps, when you talk about the detail of the book being one of the strengths. That's kind of one of the, obviously it's one of the, to me, it's one of the strengths of the book anyway. And Dave was very, very pivotal to that.
What lessons do you want people to take away from the book?
Oh man. I think it's that what we talked about previously about how there's that missing element of wrestling about taking chances with a character and evolving and not settling to be the same thing forever. I think it really feels like it's missing today. That kind of that I don't know if it's just that hunger to like really be a top guy. I don't know if it's, again, maybe it's because there's only one place to go in North America that can make you big money. Obviously, you got like guys in the indies who can make big money by merchandising themselves. But I think that in terms of like a stable position, not a lot of guys can be the Young Bucks. There can only really be a handful of guys who can be that big at that level. So I think that a lot of guys get to WWE and they just want to stay there and ride the wave maybe as long as they can. I don't know what it is. Maybe they don't want to take the risks because with great risk sometimes comes great reward, but sometimes it fails. And I think, Pillman had enough confidence in himself that he wasn't afraid to fail. Same with Steve Austin. These guys that did take chances and try to change and evolve to find what worked so that they would eventually succeed. And I think when you read the book, I think that one of the things that really kind of stands out is that he explored so many different avenues, not just in coming up with a character or coming up with different things, but in picking people's brains, in researching and trying to learn as much about the business as he possibly could. So, again, even in the loose cannon chapter of the book, when he's reading all these con man books to kind of understand how to manipulate people in real life, the movies he watched to kind of get in that mindset of how to manipulate people, for his end game. And just, I think that is kind of really one of the major things that comes out. But I think one of the other lessons too is, you can't go too far in that kind of blurring of fantasy and reality like Brian did, because it came with a price, a big price.
Yeah, your comments on Meltzer made me think of this, because reading the book, I learned so much about his early life that I didn't know, going in. And I knew a little bit about his health troubles as a kid, but you really lay it all out, and then you see how Brian really had kind of an addictive personality. He would, like you said, he would just throw himself into something and just really go after it. And first it's football, and how he did whatever it took to succeed at football. People didn't think he could make his high school team. He makes it all the way to the Cincinnati Bengals, and he's dedicating himself in the weight room. He's putting on all these pounds. He gets, he's on his way out of football. Kim Wood turns him on to pro wrestling. And then the connection there with Dave that I found so interesting is how Wood got Pillman that subscription to the Wrestling Observer. And you talk about how Brian just poured over the Observer like week after week to really learn the business, because maybe you can talk about this. He didn't really grow up a wrestling fan, right? He was vaguely kind of familiar with it. I think you said, was it his grandmother or his grandfather was into it?
Yeah, his grandmother used to watch big time wrestling, which was Sheik's territory that played to Ohio. And he was aware of it. He would watch it a little bit just when he was hanging out with his family, but he was always out playing sports, so he wasn't really much of a TV watcher. And I think one of the things that really is interesting, actually, when you really kind of look at the book, and it kind of took me sitting back and really thinking about it when it was finished to kind of realize that it's really a unique way, especially back then. A guy who didn't really know that much about the business being smartened up by someone who's also outside the business, and kind of looking at it through a different lens than most of the guys did, because a lot of the guys, they kind of come in with big, the deer in the headlights, and they get they're green and everything like that, and it's interesting that Kim Wood, who is a ridiculously intelligent guy, he was the one to smarten up Brian. I mean, Brian had the attitude that wrestlers were, again, as Kim says in the book, these guys weren't alpha males playing the role of alpha males, but aren't really that tough. And Brian was a legitimate tough guy. I mean, a really, really tough guy.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of really, you see that a lot. And I remember that Kim had told me, which I didn't put in the book, that they had talked originally about like what it was like at the top in the main companies, and how that the perception that Brian had was that these guys were like, they were like borderline mentally ill. These the wrestlers, because obviously they, with everything they go through and just the confidence issues and the gossiping and the backstage chaos and blah 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 blah. It's the schedule, everything, the physical demands. And then when Brian got to WCW and Kim asked him, "Is it like we always thought it was?" And Brian said, "It's actually worse. Like all the top guys, everybody, even the top guys, they're just barely hanging on." Like, and you talk about how Flair was just, who at that time was like the booker and the WCW champion, just looked so tired and looked like he was just going to crack any day now. And eventually, he did. But yeah, so I mean, that's the perception going in, and when that's the perception of these guys, Brian, who's accomplished something in the real world, the NFL, he made it to the NFL when he was never supposed to, and now he's in this predetermined world that he's kind of learning, and he kind of sees these guys as just kooks, these odd characters who, can be really majorly messed with, I think he just kind of saw it like he was destined to succeed. He didn't have any confidence issues. He was going to make it. As long as he did everything he could, he was going to make it. And unfortunately, he did, but he didn't.
Flair was the one booker Brian got along with in WCW.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
I think that there was a natural personality kind of bit of synergy there, I suppose. I don't know if that's the right word, but they had a lot in common in terms of, their partying habits and stuff like that. And Cornette kind of put it well in the book, where Flair's introduction to the business again in the AWA and training in Vern Gagne's camp and stuff, where you got guys like him and Ricky Steamboat and all these guys who are studs, these young guys who work hard with a good body, and a lot of guys in the business are marks for real athletes, or at least were back then. Someone who actually done something in the real world is kind of stands out to these guys who, in many respects haven't. And yeah, I just think that, Flair kind of liked Pillman because it kind of reminded him of a young version of himself, to be quite honest. I think that he saw a guy a real athlete, good looking guy, was new to the business, but had already got a little bit of an aptitude for it. You could see that he was going to be better than he was in his early days. You could see the potential in him straight away. And I think that Flair just saw him and just thought, this guy, in this landscape, in WCW right now, a guy that looks like this, with a body like this, with, the ability to pull chicks and was a tough guy, is this guy appeals to Flair. I mean, he had a drinking buddy, and Flair loved to drink with Brian Pillman.
Yeah, those stories were incredible. People need to check the book out solely for that. If nothing else, I mean, I was just laughing because every image you have of Ric Flair in 1990 is sort of confirmed in the book. And by the way, kids, if you haven't seen it, you got to watch Flair versus Pillman, February 1990. Was that? I can't even remember the name of it. They had so many syndicated. Was that the Power Hour? It's a really good hour of TV. It's the same hour that Lex Luger turns babyface. I can never remember what the name of the show was, if it was the Power Hour or if it was Main Event.
The one where it was him and Flair was Saturday night, I think.
Okay, or the other one, Saturday night. There you go. Okay, thank you. People talk about it's February of 1990. Regardless, people, you can find it somewhere. What was your favorite story about Brian that you found out in doing the book that you didn't know before?
Oh man, that's a great question. It's kind of like picking my children. I think that I got some really good ones that I couldn't put in the book because they asked me not to, which I might tell you about off air. But I love the stuff about how, man, I love the Bill Kazmaier stories. When he's just messing with Bill Kazmaier, to me that's awesome. I love that stuff. I loved finding out stuff about the loose cannon. I love finding out that his goal, he had a long-term vision in mind to get a Screen Actors Guild card. Little details like that are just really interesting. Like, that's kind of kind of getting an idea of the way his mind works and the way he ticks. I loved finding out about how he actually made the Bengals, because he was brought in as a political move, not necessarily to be he wasn't brought in as a free agent so that he could make the team. I know this has nothing to do with wrestling necessarily, but to me, it's a fascinating story about him and his attitude, which it kind of echoes later in life about how here's a guy who was not supposed to succeed. He was brought in as a political move, and he gets injured, so he's even more against the 8 ball, but he somehow finds a way to make the team. And that determination, that grit, that unshakable will, and not letting an injury get in his way is this source of great achievement for Brian in the end. But at the end of his life, it's not quite so good when he does the same thing.
Yeah, whenever I hear the Ed Block Courage Award, there's only one name that I ever think of whenever they bring that up in the NFL nowadays. I always have visions of. I can hear Jim Ross in my right ear going, "My God, he won the Ed Block Courage Award." I know Norman. I know Boomer and the boys are having a big Capital Combat party. I could not believe he said that on pay-per-view. Boomer. I just picture Boomer Esiason and Sam White sitting on the couch watching Capital Combat 90. That just makes me laugh very hard.
Oh yeah.
Liam, what actually, I just want to go way back to how you became a fan of Brian real quick, because you mentioned right at the start of this interview how you had really been studying him for a long time. What was it about him that just really drew you in as a kid watching his career? What do you have any particular match or angle that you remember that really locked you in on Brian Pillman, or what was it about him that made him so appealing to you?
No, I hated him. When I was a kid, I hated his guts. Which is funny now, but like when I was a kid, obviously WCW and WF were pretty big here in the UK anyway in the early 90s, and WF had a great time slot on Sky, and obviously got a ton of pub for SummerSlam 92 in Wembley. WCW had a better time slot somehow, and even though the show just sucked. But some of my earliest memories of watching WCW worldwide are when Brian turned heel and slapped Brad Armstrong at that Clash of the Champions, his Clash 20. Yes. And I remember he had this sarcastic, I just hate his guts. I don't even know what it was. It's just, as a Mark kid, I just couldn't stand him. There was something about this guy that I just hate. And as I watch more wrestling, obviously, and you fall in love with it, you go to the video store, that relic of history. Might as well be talking about the Titanic, but you go to the video store, and I would get more WCW stuff. And there's Brian Pillman as this amazing babyface, and that was where I kind of was jarred, because like, this guy's actually pretty great. Like, how is here's a guy that like I hate, and he's a great kind of mid-card heel at the time. And obviously and then he starts teaming with Austin, and that makes me hate him even more. And then I go back and watch these tapes, and he's just such a great babyface. And then he's having the match with Liger, and I'm blown away, and it's everything like that where it kind of just changed my perception of him pretty early on. He's probably one of the first guys that I just kind of looked at and just thought, did you get the same thing, Kyle? This is a great question for you. I always got the sense when I was younger and I watched Brian that he was one of the guys where there was more to him than most of the other guys. I don't even know if that makes any sense, but it's that thing where like you see a guy, Foley was similar for me, where it's like you can see, you look at him and you're like, there's more to this guy. There's something intrinsically in him that's more interesting, and you can see that he can do great things, but they're just not doing it in the current environment because WCW sucks.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because it always... when I'm 10 or 11 years old and I'm exposed to Brian Pillman for the first time, I didn't know how to quantify it as, oh, this guy should be pushed more. That was not something that was in my head.
Yeah,
like I kind of understood how it worked. But yeah, I remember because it's funny, I'm a little older than you, and I kind of went the other way. Like I soured on him as a babyface worker, and then by 92, and then once that heel turn went, and to be fair, by 1993, I was kind of a guy who would like cheer for the heels. Anyway, I was a big Shawn Michaels guy, and I was just like, wow, like this guy is just like reborn. It's just like as soon as that heel turn hit, and if you want to watch people, by the way, I think I heard they're uploading a lot of the WCW Saturday nights from that time period, so people will be able to go back and watch this on the network pretty soon. That transformation, because he was kind of the light heavyweight division was dying at the time. He had lost to like Scotty Flamingo, and he was hurt for like part of the fall, if I remember. And he just was a guy who I was like, Brian Pillman, he kind of like gets his ass kicked, and and I'm just kind of sorry. And then that heel turn happened. I'm like, holy shit, is this guy really good at doing this? And then California, and you mentioned that he had that period, 94, 95. Prior to Loose Cannon, where again he was kind of like a dead in the water baby face, turns heel again in the end of 95, and you're just like, wow. I mean, it was crazy. And then he's the talk of the internet a few months later.
Oh yeah. That's actually interesting that it works that way for you, because obviously you if you got into it earlier and that's your. But that's the thing. Like, by the time the Blondes were kind of on a roll and were tag team champions, by then I kind of already figured out, like, this guy's actually really, really good. And again, I was early in my fandom, so I'm kind of still trying to figure out, like, what that means really. But at the same time, it's like he's just, him and Austin, I just thought they were so good near the end. It's like, this team, like, and it helped that they were in a barren wasteland in WCW that was just absolute garbage in 1993. It was like them and Vader and little else. But yeah, it's quite an interesting take, because it's the same thing where eventually I kind of doubled down and soured on him as a babyface as well afterwards, when he was just doing nothing in the Hogan years until he went heel. And then again, it's like, just out of nowhere, like a phoenix.
It's funny you mention how awful WCW was in 1993, because when I was growing up, I was just hardcore all WWF. I hardly ever watched WCW. And around 1993, one of my cousins gave me like a box of WCW trading cards, and I did not know Brian Pillman at all at that stage of my life. And I remember seeing Flying Brian on the cards and him flying through the air and thinking, this guy looks pretty cool, I'd like to check him out. But then I hated WCW so much I never really watched it. And I didn't really know Pillman until he came to the WWF. And I was pretty young. I'm like 6th or 7th grade, and I like to be like the smart fan among my friends back then. Like, oh, did you know this guy was in WCW in this tag team called the Hollywood Blondes? And like, none of my friends watched WCW, but I remember there being such an emphasis when he signed, with like the press conference. They showed like clips of that on TV. And the big memory I have of him coming to the WWF was he did some announcing, but then the thing he did with Austin on, I think it was Superstars, with the chair and him stomping on his ankle with the chair. And that really made me take notice of him. But I went back years later and then watched all the early 90s WCW stuff. And the stuff with Liger really blew me away, like you guys have talked about. But I almost wish that I had watched it live and not seen it years later.
Yeah. It's funny because, like, when you actually look at it, by the time he gets to the WWF, he doesn't really do a lot of great stuff there, to be honest. It's few and far between, unfortunately, because of the state he's in. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, like, if you're looking for the best work of Brian Pillman's career in the ring, obviously it comes way before he gets to the WWF. But he still gets his moments here and there, and he gets the Canadian Stampede, which is a great show. So it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Yeah, and the thing too with Brian is what really I didn't really gain the full appreciation for him. I'll be honest, until years later you go back and watch some of the interviews, the funny stuff that he would slip in. Like, the Blondes were doing an interview and Ricky Steamboat came out. And what did he say? I have to say, he said something like, "Oh, here comes the family man. His 3 illegitimate children nowhere in sight." And it's just stuff like that is so awesome that you don't hear. And you had one of my favorite lines in the book. I popped when I saw this in the book, Liam, is when he first came to WWF. I think his first live appearance was King of the Ring '96. If it wasn't the first, it was the first. But when he comes out and Jim Ross interviews him, and JR just has this look on his face like, oh, I can't even believe what this guy's going to say. And he looks out. They're in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee. It's the night Austin, coined the famous phrase, Austin 369, whipped your ass. And Pillman just goes, well, look in here. It's easy to see why Jeffrey Dahmer tried consuming this entire state from head to toe. And Jim Ross just is like, damn it. Like, I think... And
yeah.
I just love, like, the great little one-liners Pillman had where, and you can't get that now. I hate to, like, be like, sound like the grandpa, get off my lawn, kids, but you can't get that kind of stuff off the cuff in promos nowadays. I mean, I guess you can, but it's just, you're not going to see it. It's an exception, not a rule. And to be fair, it was an exception, not a rule back then. Brian was ahead of his time, like.
Yeah, but I think the funny thing is there's so much of that. Like that, there's like, when it comes time to edit the book and I'm having to chop stuff out, there's the period in the book where I'm just quoting him on commentary and Shotgun Saturday Night. And he's just got so many amazing lines. And there's one where I think they're in like Seattle. Well, they are definitely in Seattle. But like, I remember reading a report that I got, when I was just trying to get everything I could possibly get a hold of Brian Pillman going out to Seattle in a Kurt Cobain t-shirt saying that if he lived there, he'd have blown his brains out too. Just like stuff like that. It's like, that's just fantastic.
Yeah. It's just, Yeah, it's just he's the guy sorely missed, was way ahead of his time. And is there anything else you'd like to share with us, Liam, about the book? I guess right now I'm trying to think what other questions. I think, I could obviously go on forever about every time period in his career, but
I got one. I got one.
Okay.
Can you speak to your relationship doing the book with Brian's son? Because I've seen some of the comments that he has made and how he learned more about his dad from your book than anywhere else, and that I got to think that's the ultimate compliment that you could ever get from this project.
Yeah, it's kind of. I wish it was, but at the same time, it's not the most heartbreaking thing you've ever heard.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
This poor kid is learning from a guy in England who's asked everybody and compiled it in one place. And I mean, it is the ultimate compliment. And Brian Jr. is just hilarious. Like if he can channel that, he's gonna make it, because he got bags of personality. He's hilarious. But I mean, getting to talk to him and kind of getting to know him a little bit was awesome, because you just kind of, there wasn't really a lot that I could ask him about his dad, because he didn't really have any memories of him, because he died when he was so young, like 3 or 4 years old. And it's like, so you can't really go, so, how about that promo your dad did that, you don't remember, kind of a thing. It's horrible to say, but I mean, that's the reality of it. They really have no memories of him, so you can't really quiz him about that. But he was just so refreshingly honest about everything that happened after his dad passed away, which is another part of the book that was not fun to write, but is massively interesting in a different type of way. But I mean, it was great getting to talk to him, just because he's such an open book, and he doesn't have any reservations about his opinions, and it's super refreshing.
Do you have any other projects in the pipeline yet? Because you're getting a lot of great publicity out of this book, and rightfully so. It like I said at the beginning of the show, this is one of the best wrestling biographies written in a long time. I think it just won the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Award for Best Wrestling Book of the Year.
Yeah, we should have said that. Unlike Okada, it didn't cost Liam any money to win that award.
Yeah, having said that, though, I just about shit my pants when I heard that I won that, because I was actually dreading it, because I just thought there's no way that I was dreading it, because I just thought, because the book was released really late in the year, it's like November, so it's like there's no way that enough people are going to have read it and or bought it, read it, calculated an opinion and vote for it at the same time. So there's no way there's going to beat Jim Ross's book. There's no way, because JR's has been so publicized and everything like that, and really this has had like no advertising other than word of mouth and just me trying to get the word out. But other than that, it's like I just couldn't believe that it not only did well but won. I was floored. But no, I mean, in terms of other projects, I'm really just kind of trying to get this as far as it can, and it's cool because there's a lot of interest in doing more with this from other sources, and maybe kind of turning this into something more than just a book. So we'll see how it goes. It's early days yet, but there's a little bit of movement on that front, so it's kind of cool to kind of think that this could actually happen.
Very cool. Yeah, well, I got to say, this book for me, it's rare that I get a wrestling book where I just can't wait to get home to read it. I think with Foley's book, I was in high school back then, but it was like, I can't wait for school to get over so I can get home and read that book. And with this book, it's the same kind of thing, but I'm older, so it's like, I can't wait to get home from work to check out the next chapter in the book. It is so well written. I've learned so much from it. I cannot recommend it enough. So any of our listeners out there, check out Crazy Like a Fox on Amazon. It is, you will learn a lot about Brian Pillman. It will make you dig through the WWE Network archives. It'll make you go to YouTube to check out some of the footage, and you'll learn how far ahead of his time Brian Pillman was, and just what a great performer he was.
Well, I'll tell you what, thank you very much for the kind words, because I appreciate any time anybody puts me in that kind of lofty category. It's just ridiculous to me. But I mean, I thank you so much for it. And I think one of the other things too, and I'd be good to kind of get your gauge on this too, just for your thoughts on it, is I think that when I was doing the book, I mean, I've been a fan for a long, long time, but actually putting this book together, it felt like I learned so much about the business in the way that the business itself was during the period of Brian's life, that in putting that through, I'm really kind of, some of the nicest feedback I've got has been people saying that it really kind of doesn't just cover Brian, but it really says a lot about the nature of the business and how kind of, it has progressed a lot in a lot of ways since then, where it really was just this. I'm sure it's a very bizarre business now too, but I mean, it was just so strange in the 80s and 90s, the way that it operated. It's so bizarre. And I think that this book kind of shines a light on it because Brian had to deal with all of it.
Yeah. The controversies that we opine about now on Twitter are nothing like what was going on behind the scenes in the world of pro wrestling in the 1980s and 1990s.
Oh man, yeah. Can you imagine if Twitter was around during Pillman's heyday, and just like some of the stuff he was doing, getting out there and pictures and video clips, it's insane.
Yeah, and I mean, he would have used that to his benefit. I mean, he could have kind of eliminated the middleman. I mean, that's what's amazing.
Oh,
I mean,
man.
who would have known? Yeah.
Imagine video recording or social media in the days of just his college career. I think some of the stories about him in college in the book are pretty funny, including the pull-up bar with the ladies. That I found that one to be pretty funny.
We're wrestling, or just wrestling a pencil. He could have just done that himself.
Yeah. Oh man, no, it is a great book. Check it out, guys. Liam, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Maybe we can get you back at some point. I hope everyone checks out the book, and thanks again for reconnecting with your old pal Kyle. It's been a blast.
No, thank you so much for having me. And like I say, anytime that you want me back on, just give me a buzz.
Sounds great. Hey, well, what are you looking forward most to at Mania? Since I know you're not going to be there this year.
Yeah, thanks for rubbing that in. I'll tell you, what's funny is like this whole. I was listening to your show a couple of weeks ago when you spent the whole show talking about doesn't this look like Daniel Bryan's coming back? And the whole show, as I'm listening to it, I'm just thinking to myself, there's no way. There's no way. And then at one point, Carl actually said, if he doesn't come back, we've just wasted a podcast. And I'm thinking to myself, you may just have, because I just can't see it happening. And now, even though I don't know what's going on with Shane, just the combination of how great he looked last week, and then how great that promo was last night. At least I thought it was, he just so much fire and so much of that real emotion that it feels rare now. And I'm just looking forward to seeing what happens there. I mean, it's actually secretly quite a loaded show, and I think it's going to be probably pretty good. I mean, you guys are probably going to be, depending on how lively the crowd can stay for such a long show and with so many big matches, which is a bit of a concern sometimes. I think that could be a hell of a show. And obviously I'm looking forward to the Daniel Bryan thing more than anything else. I love Nakamura. I think that him and Styles could have a great match, but it's a babyface match. Who knows what it's going to be? And there's just enough on the show that I think is going to be really, really interesting to watch. But Bryan takes it for me.
Yeah. Is it terrible? I told this to Ryan already, that as soon as they broke the news of Daniel Bryan coming back, I was like, thank God that podcast is not going to be the most mocked thing in the history of the internet now. Because we got way into that. And then, you're right. I did say that. I'm like, guys, if Daniel Bryan is not the mystery partner, we are the dumbest sons of bitches that have ever tried to do a wrestling podcast of all time.
Kyle sent me a text message the next morning. Like, I get up and Kyle's got a message waiting on my phone. He's like, guys, I think it could be Chris Jericho. I think we just wasted our time.
I was just trying to prep us. I was like, guys, it's going to be this guy. And then they pulled up Fozzie's schedule, and they're like, it is impossible for him to make it from New Hampshire to New Orleans at that time. I'm like, Chris Jericho is appearing at WrestleMania. It's settled. It was. We were a few days ahead of the curve there. I'm kind of proud of that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, I wish Justin could have made the interview, because when I first met Justin, our other co-host, who we've talked about on the show, is super excited for the Bryan stuff too, and Cena Undertaker. One of the first conversations I ever had with him was about the Pillman Liger match, and
that's right. You mentioned that to me.
Yeah, that is like one of his all-time favorite matches. So
I can tell you a story about the Omni match off air. I've got what's that?
The Christmas match?
Yes, I've got one hell of a story about that match for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, guys. With that said, thanks for tuning in. Check us out on iTunes, TopRopeNation.com, Stitcher Radio, tune in wherever podcasts are found. Thanks again to our guest, Liam O'Rourke. Check out Crazy Like a Fox, and we will be back next week with our WrestleMania preview show. So we will talk to you all then.